Well, good morning. It's a real pleasure to be here. We're going to change gears a little bit now, and we're going to talk a little bit about kind of an introduction to the Klondike District, this place that we've all come to visit. Some of us have been here longer than others. I've given this kind of a fanciful title. We're looking at tracking the elephant. I've been working in mineral exploration in the Klondike and doing research related to mineral exploration, particularly trying to find the lode source for many, many years. And it's an exciting time right now. There's a lot of new initiatives going on, and I think we're finally to the point where we're perhaps close to making some progress in actually finding where the gold may have actually come from. What I want to do then is give you a bit of an interview, give you a bit of an introduction to the history of the Klondike, the history of exploration, both for placer gold and for lode gold, and then give you a bit of an update of where we are at the moment and some of the research directions we're moving in and how that's helping us try to constrain where the gold may have been coming from. Can I advance it from here? Yes, no? Where's that? Oh, there we go. Thank you. Can everyone hear me if I stand off to the side and talk very loudly? That way I can see a little bit better. Thank you.
It won't record though.
Okay, I better stand close. This is a little bit of an interview that, an introduction rather, to the history of exploration for placer gold in the Klondike. Gold was discovered in, as many of you know, probably most of you know, on August 16th of 1896. It was discovered on a rather insignificant little stream that was called Rabbit Creek at the time, promptly renamed Bonanza Creek. And within a very, very short period of time, virtually all of the placer miners in the northern Canada and Alaska had moved to Dawson and moved to the Klondike to begin looking at this new gold discovery. This is a picture of of Rabbit Creek or Bonanza Creek taken within a few months of the actual discovery, and believe me, this looks like any other swampy creek anywhere in the Klondike. I've tromped through many of them and perhaps never really realized that I might be standing on another Klondike. Next slide, please. The word got out to the rest of the world next July. It took a little while for the gold to actually make its way out. Within 6 months of the discovery or of the arrival of gold in Seattle, the first ton of gold from the Klondike in Seattle, over 100,000 people had headed for the Klondike. It was one of the most massive gold rushes certainly in North American history. Only about 30,000 people actually completed the journey. But within 2 years of discovery, Dawson City, where we are right now, was the biggest city north of San Francisco, with a population of about 30,000. Next, please. And during the gold rush, we have all these wonderful pictures from the gold rush era, when the early stages of the placer mining. People looking very happy about having lots of nuggets in their pan. A few people like this fellow here, perhaps not being quite so thrilled about the whole operation, but just a wonderful sense of history in the Klondike. Next, please. Within about 3 years, something on the order of 2.5 million ounces of gold was recovered. Something like 87 tons of gold was recovered from the Klondike, almost entirely by hand methods. These were extraordinarily rich placer deposits. Just some pictures here showing some of the early operations. Mechanical mining methods very quickly were brought into play to try and recover some of the lower grade ground and be able to recover gold in a much larger scale of operation. By about 1900, most of the placer ground in the Klondike was tied up, and the small-time operators and family operators simply couldn't operate anymore. Most of them, or many of the people, had left the Klondike by about 1900. And the first dredge was installed in 1901. It was a steam-powered dredge. Picture of it shown here. Next, please. Dredging very rapidly became the major mining method that was employed in the Klondike. There was a number of major companies that had locked up very large amounts of the ground in the Klondike. And by 1906, dredging was very widespread and continued from then until the early 1960s or mid-1960s. And just various pictures here showing some of the dredging operations on lower Klondike River, just outside of town here. A view looking up lower Bonanza Creek, where we'll drive up just before lunch today. Everything had been completely dredged to that point. This is the old dredge, the main dredge station at Googieville, which is now an RV park. All of the gravels, of course, were mainly frozen at that point, so all of the gravels had to be thawed before they could be dredged. And this was a huge operation, these massive, massive banks of steam points that were using steam to thaw the gravels. Next, please. Last dredge shut down in about 1966. This is when all of the ground that was considered to be amenable or suitable for dredging had been largely exhausted. And we see various dredges that are kind of scattered around, abandoned, pretty much where they last operated around the Klondike. The one that's best known, some of you will have a chance to visit it on Bonanza Creek, is dredge number 4, which has been refloated, moved up, but so it's a little bit easier to get to, and it's now quite a tourist attraction. Next, please. What's going on in the Klondike right now in terms of placer operations? Smaller scale mechanical operations, mechanical mining operations are being done in various areas using trommels and more typically bulldozer, sluices, front end loaders and so on. Hydraulicking, which was used very widely during the early stages of the Klondike placer mining, where you basically just use a huge nozzle or monitor to blast down the overlying material and wash it away. It's still being used very locally, but the problem with this is it washes a huge amount of material into the streams, and environmentalists get quite annoyed at us when we do that. Next, please. There are some larger operations, placer operations that have gone on and are still going on. This was one that operated a number of years ago on Lower Bonanza Creek, very large scale, relatively large scale operation for placer mining in the Klondike. There are some huge operations on Lower Dominion Creek down in the southern part of the Klondike district as well. Next, please. So what is the Klondike? When we talk about the Klondike, what are we talking about? I hope you can all see this better than I can. Dawson City, we're sitting right up here in the northwest corner of the Klondike. This red line here outlines the area we normally call the Klondike. It's a very small area. It's about 1,500 square kilometers. It's tiny by comparison to most placer areas in the world. Within that area, some of the main streams that I'll be referring to from time to time, Bonanza Creek and El Dorado Creek were two of the richest streams. We'll be driving up there just before lunch, and the Klondike Star Camp is about in this area in here. Other major placer streams were Hunker Creek, Dominion Creek, Sulphur, and Quartz Creek. Indian River down on the south side of the southwest side of the Klondike is a major placer producer now. It's not normally considered to be, strictly speaking, part of the Klondike. It was not part of the historical area mined during the Klondike, the main Klondike rush. Next, please. So how much gold actually came out of the Klondike? This is something that people always want to know. The total recorded production is about, this is based on royalties paid, is about 12.5 million fine ounces. Okay? But, of course, placer miners are like everybody else. We don't like to pay taxes unless we absolutely have to. So the consensus is that at least twice that much, and perhaps 4 times that much, was probably actually produced and kind of spirited out of the country in various suitcases and things like that. So we're probably looking at a total productivity of placer gold, something on the order of 750 to perhaps as much as 1,500 tons. About 10 to 20 billion US at present day prices. More if prices are what they should be. And this is from an area that was only about 50 kilometers by 30 kilometers. It's a tiny, tiny little area. And so the Klondike really was one of the truly great placer districts in the world. There's still some placer production coming out. Something on the order of about 80,000 ounces per ton of placer gold is being produced from the Klondike. This represents most of what's being produced in all of the Yukon Territory. Most of that now is coming from the Indian River on the south side. Next, please. So I want to say a few words about the placer geology. I'm not going to bore you with a lot of details about placers and how they form, and also with the lode geology, but I just want to touch on a couple of key things. It's important to realize that in the Klondike there's 2 main types of placer deposits. There's a set of old gravels that we call the white channel gravels, called so because they're brilliant white when you see them. These are older gravels that contain placer gold at their base, and they're preserved now on raised terraces that sit well above the present level of the streams in the Klondike. And then we have the recent streams that are cut down through that raised terrace and also contain a substantial amount of gold. Next, please. This is a view looking down Lower Bonanza Creek. We'll drive up along this road and you can peer back over your shoulders. What you see here is white channel gravels of these older deposits sitting up on these raised benches. Next, please. There's a bedrock terrace. It's a nice, very, very flat terrace that comes all the way across here. The white channel, these very bright white deposits that contain gold at their base, are sitting on top of that raised terrace. But this is the bed of the recent stream. So there's gold in the recent stream. There's also gold at the base of these older gravel deposits. Next. A similar view looking up Hunker Creek, same thing. Present trace of Hunker Creek is here. White channel gravel sitting on top of a bedrock terrace right in there and right in there. Next. So the distribution then of the placer, or the development of the placer gold in the Klondike looks something like this. We started, this is from work by Grant Lowy at the Yukon Geological Survey. We started with bedrock sources in here being eroded that initially deposited gold as the White Channel gravel was being deposited. White Channel gravel system looked something like this. Very broad, wide, relatively low gradient streams with very, very broad valley beds. Gold being eroded from local sources and dumped into the White Channel gravels and accumulated on that bedrock terrace. That the whole area was subsequently uplifted, and the recent streams have cut down through that. So the gold in the recent streams includes some gold that's being eroded directly from lode sources and some that's being reworked and reconcentrated from the base of the White Channel gravels. This is the reason that some of the the placers in the recent streams are so extraordinarily rich. They're reconcentrated. Next. And if we look at the distribution of the White Channel gravels, which I hope you can see, it's these sort of yellow bits that trace along all of the modern streams. And what we see is that the main placer gold streams that I just described earlier are actually incised into older White Channel streams. Okay, so it's not as though we have recent streams that are completely crisscrossing and cutting right across the old White Channel drainage system. They're simply incised into the old drainage system. Okay, next. A lot of the placer gold in the Klondike looks pretty rough. Looks like this. Next. We see a lot of crystalline gold. We see wire gold, all sorts of bizarre forms that are not bizarre, but very, very interesting and very intriguing forms. We're doing some work now trying to understand the crystallinity of the gold, try to understand what controls that. Why do we get octahedral crystals in some cases, tetragonal in others, things like that. What's that telling us about the nature of the gold? Next. So gold-bearing quartz veins were discovered in the Klondike within a year of the discovery of placer gold on Bonanza Creek. Discovery claim on Bonanza Creek is right there, just below the old town of Grand Forks. The old-timers prospected that pay streak up Bonanza Creek, up to Grand Forks, up what we call Upper Bonanza Creek, up Victoria Gulch, and got to an area called the Lone Star Mine, which some of you will have a chance to visit this afternoon. It's an area that Klondike Stars is exploring and drilling at the moment. Next. These are just some pictures of the Lone Star operation. This is the only hard rock mine that ever actually produced any gold in the Klondike. A couple of views of the open cut as they were mining. The old, what we call a Chateau Lone Star, which some of us have lived in for extended periods of time. This is the little trellis at the very top of the tram line, which went down to a stamp mill down in Victoria Gulch. And even in the early days, 1907, people were pretty excited about Lone Star. Millions of dollars have been made in quartz. We have the mother lode sure. There you go. Next. But there was a lot of hard rock exploration going on elsewhere in the Klondike as well. And all of these stars show other known lode gold-bearing vein systems that have been discovered in the Klondike. And they're scattered throughout much of the Klondike. Next. We see remnants of some of the old hard rock exploration. This is a picture of the old open cut at the Lone Star, taken before there was rather massive bulldozer trenches put through the middle of it. The old stamp mill at Lone Star, a smaller stamp mill operation at the Virgin property on Lower Bear Creek, and a rather small little head frame at the Violet occurrence that's across the El Dorado Creek from Lone Star. Next. But here's the sort of conundrum we face. There was at least 375 tons of gold, possibly as much as 1,500 tons of gold produced by placers in the Klondike. The total production of lode gold was less than 40 kilograms. So there's an obvious question, where did all the placer gold come from? And that's what I want to address for the rest of the talk. Next. These are some of the questions that I very commonly get asked about the Klondike. The first one, how do we know that all the gold that we see that was recovered from the placers actually came from the Klondike? How do we know it was not simply transported in from somewhere else and deposited in the Klondike? Secondly, there's been a lot of exploration, hard rock exploration that's been carried out in the Klondike over the years, and an obvious question is why have none of these programs met with huge amounts of success? What's the problem here? Thirdly, how some of the recent exploration efforts and some of the research that we've been carrying out on the Klondike gold, the placer and lode gold and the geology, how have that helped try to tell us or try to explain to us where the placer gold has actually come from? And then finally, the big one, is there really still potential for a major lode source in the Klondike that might produce an economic mine? What I'm going to do then is I'm going to talk very briefly about the first point. I'll address the second two together, and then I'll finish off with the last one. Next. Okay, I'm not going to bore you with details of geology, but the question of how do we know the gold all came from the Klondike is fairly simple. This is a compilation of geology based on mapping I've been doing here over the years in the Klondike district and the surrounding regions. What we find is this package that's shown in green and this package of orange in here is a rock unit we call the Klondike schist. It's a very distinctive rock unit. It's distinctive in terms of age, composition, so on, geochemistry. It's mainly exposed in the Klondike. It underlies the Klondike district itself. There's also rocks like this that are present in a smaller area to the northwest and another small area far to the west. But the point is, the Klondike schist sits as a relatively isolated little area of distinctive rock types, and it's surrounded on all sides by quite different packages or different rock units. Okay? So if the placer deposits in the Klondike consisted of gold that was transported in, say, from the south, we would expect all of the gravels that hosted or much of the gravel that host the gold would also be of the compositions that we see out here. Okay? If the gold was being moved in, the gravels would have been moved in as well, and we'd see sort of exotic rock types. Just go back for a second, please. We'd see exotic rock types down in this, in the gravels that would reflect bedrock from down in this area. We don't see that at all. All of the gravels, all of the clasts, all the boulders and so on that we see in the gravels that host the placer gold in the Klondike are derived from the Klondike. Next, please. So basically, we view the Klondike placer system, what we're looking at here. This is sort of a very stylized version of the present erosion surface in the Klondike down here. The Klondike placers are what we call a residual placer. Basically what's happened, we've weathered and we've eroded a very large rock mass that originally overlay the present ground surface, and everything, including the bits of rock that were there and the gold contained within them, have simply been concentrated down onto the present rock surface. So this is a residual placer. And everything, which tells us that basically all the placer gold came actually from the Klondike itself, which bodes well for lode exploration. Next. Another line of evidence that we can use is we can study the shape, and again, I won't go into details, is we study the evolution of the shapes of the grains. What we've been able to do in the Klondike, this is work that I did in the 90s with John Knight, who was at UBC at the time, and we're developing this further now, is look at the evolution, particularly of the degree of flattening of the placer gold grains. As a gold particle is transported down a stream, you can imagine it's being hammered constantly between different boulders and cobbles, and as it moves farther and farther down the stream, it gets smashed flatter and flatter and flatter. And you can actually develop a curve that relates the degree of flattening, how flat the average particle is, to the distance it's traveled. And so what we've been able to do with that, next please. Oh, sorry, let me just mention one other method that we're using. No, go to the next one, please. We've also looked at the composition of the placer gold in various streams in the Klondike, and we've looked at the composition of the gold in the various lode occurrences. And what we find is we can develop a very specific fingerprint for gold derived from various lode sources. And we can use that to recognize or to identify in a sample of placer gold. We can go in and analyze those particles and say, yes, on the basis of the composition of these particles, they've clearly come from quartz veins in that particular part of the Klondike. Next, please. What this has allowed us to do is to identify several main areas that have produced placer gold, or that lode sources from which placer gold has been derived in the Klondike. One of them is the Lone Star area where Klondike Star is working. There's another one in Upper Bear Creek, Upper Last Chance Creek, another one up near King Solomon Dome in the high point in the center of the district that many of you may have been to, and another one down in the southern part of the Klondike down here. These are all quite distinctive sources of gold, okay, on the basis of their composition. Next. So what this has allowed us to do, the studying the placer gold itself, both in terms of shape, the evolution of the shape and the composition, is we've identified basically four major areas that appear to have been the sources within the Klondike, that appear to have been the sources of almost all, I would say probably at least, at a guess, say 90% of the placer gold that was recovered here. Seems to have been derived from four main areas. One is the Lone Star Ridge area between El Dorado Creek and Upper Bonanza. One is Upper Bear Creek and Upper Last Chance Creek up here. There's a major source up near the head of near King Solomon Dome itself, which seems to have appears to have fed much of the gold in Upper and Middle Hunker Creek. Most of the gold in Dominion Creek and in Sulphur Creek. And then there's another small but apparently quite rich source down here on Gold Run Creek, which fed much of the placer gold into the lower part of Dominion Creek. So even though I said that the Klondike district itself is quite small in comparison with other placer districts in the world, The total area that seems to have generated most of the placer gold is even smaller. It's actually a very, very small portion of the Klondike. Next. So the question then is, well, why have previous exploration efforts not been terribly successful in actually identifying a major lode deposit that one can go out and start to mine? There's four main reasons, I think. One of them is that a lot of the companies that have worked here have had an incomplete understanding of the geology of the Klondike. Companies, for the most part, have been working on a property scale rather than a regional scale, and I'll explain why that's important in a second. A lot of the work has been very much model-driven, and finally, we have to deal with the so-called nugget effect, and I'll go through each of these just very briefly. Next. The Klondike is a tough area to work. It's geologically extremely complex, and there's virtually no exposure. So it's certainly one of the toughest areas to do geological mapping in that I've tried to ever take on. Basically, the preferred field vehicle is a very large backhoe. You can drive around, create your own outcrops. But without the bedrock that has been exposed by placer operations, there would be no possible way of figuring out what's going on in the Klondike. It's very, very tough to work in this area. And you can imagine, if you can see an area like this, if you staked a hard rock property in that area, you'd have absolutely no outcrop to work with. So trying to figure out what the underlying geology was would be pretty difficult. You have to approach it from a district scale. And that's the approach that I've been taking, mapping the entire district and much of the surrounding area, and then bringing that expertise to bear on property scale questions. Next, please. One of the other problems is, as I said, people have been very model driven. By that I mean they come into the Klondike thinking that they know for certain what the style of lode source is that they're looking for. Now, one of the problems that you run into in the Klondike, based on my work up here, there's at least 9 completely distinct and unrelated styles of mineralization in the Klondike. Not all of them have any gold in them, but these are all very different styles of mineralization. And many companies have come into the Klondike and they've tried to roll all the different physical and geochemical characteristics that are typical of all these different styles of mineralization into one grand singularity model and try to apply that to the Klondike, and to no one's surprise, this actually doesn't work. And most people have walked away saying there simply is no lode source in the Klondike. It magically appeared from a meteorite or something. We've done a lot of work over the years on these different styles of mineralization, and the one critical thing is of all of these 9 different types of lode gold or lode mineralization we know to be present in the Klondike, only one, quartz veins hosted within the Klondike schist, have ever been shown to contain any gold at all. Next slide, please. The problem is there's quartz veins and there's quartz veins in the Klondike. There's an early generation of quartz veins that we call segregation of foliform veins that make up at least 95% of the quartz veins in the Klondike. This is what most of the early work was done by the old-timers, did most of their work on this. These veins contain no gold. So virtually all of the early work that was done in the Klondike was on veins that simply have no gold whatsoever. Next slide. There's a later set of veins we refer to as discordant veins. They're relatively young. They cross-cut the layering. The overall layering in the schist is here. The veins are cross-cutting at a high angle typically. They can be quite large. This is the Sheba vein up near King Solomon Dome, several meters wide. These are the ones that contain the gold. And unless you can recognize that, you don't have a chance of making any sense of this area. Next, please. Just a couple of views of foliform veins versus the discordant veins, as we call them. Foliform veins, my laser pointer doesn't die, typically lenticular and sort of aligned along the layering in the schist, the discordant, and contain no gold. The discordant veins clearly cross-cut. The layering in the schist is here. The discordant veins clearly cross-cut them. Once you get your eye tuned into it, it's very clear whether you're looking at foliform or discordant. The old-timers were unable to do that. Next, please. We're doing quite a lot of work now trying to understand the structural controls in these discordant veins. Can we predict where they're most likely to occur? Can we predict what the extent of these discordant veins should be? This is a vein system that was exposed during preparation of the Klondike Star Camp. There wasn't known to be a quartz vein system there, and a more or less random cut put in exposed this very nice, very strong quartz vein, and we're trying to do, and we'll have a chance to look at that up. It's right behind the Klondike Star Camp. We'll have a chance to look at that later today. Work that's ongoing now, this is Tim Liverton, one of the Klondike Star geologists, Mike Begbie, who's a postdoctoral fellow working with me. We're trying to understand the structural controls of the veins in the Klondike, trying to be predictive, trying to use that information to feed back into the exploration effort. Next, please. The final problem that we run into is the so-called nugget effect. There's been lots of instances where one company will go in, put down, for example, a reverse circulation hole, get some good grades. Another company will come in and try and twin that hole a few meters away, say with a diamond drill hole, and we'll get nothing at all. And this raises all sorts of questions about what's the distribution of the gold like? Were those initial assays from the reverse circulation hole, was that total nonsense or what? The problem is the gold distribution is quite heterogeneous in the Klondike, within the Klondike veins. These are just a couple of shots that Tim Liverton gave me from scans of some of the recent drill core that the Klondike star guys have been coming up with. It's difficult to see, but what we see, this is a quartz vein here with pyrite and a speck of gold in it. This is a tiny little grain of gold that's actually within the schist itself, which is another style of mineralization that's developed locally. The point is, the distribution of gold is not uniform within the veins, and if you take a sample from here, you're going to get nothing. You take a sample from here, you're going to get a whacking great assay number. This is one of the problems that we're facing, is the so-called nugget effect. Next, please. The solution that the Klondike Star is using now, which I think makes a very, very large amount of sense, is basically to bulk test. The only way, if you want to try to make a mine up here, we need to know what happens when you put a ton of gold through a test mill or through a mine mill, rather than when you put a tiny little fist-sized piece. So bulk testing, I think, is the solution to get around the nugget effect problem, and I'm certainly looking forward to seeing the results of the bulk testing that the Klondike Star is carrying out right now. I think those numbers should be much more consistent and much more realistic and much more representative than a lot of the assay work from drill work that's been done in the past. Next, please. So the final question then is there really potential for a major lode gold deposit in the Klondike? And I would make these points. We've shown that the Klondike placer gold, on the basis of our compositional and shape studies, the Klondike placer gold was derived from these quartz vein systems. They could be, some people would call them mesothermal, some would call them metamorphogenic, some would call them orogenic gold. These are the kind of gold-bearing quartz veins that I've been describing to you. If you consider this on a kind of a global, from a global point of view, this style of vein mineralization is typically mineralized over several thousand meters. So a lot of vertical extent. We see no indication in the veins that, as they're exposed presently in the Klondike, to indicate that we're at the roots of the system, that we're at the very bottom. So I would suggest that there is every reason to think that the mineralization that we see exposed in places like El Dorado or Lone Star Ridge, El Dorado Creek, King Solomon Dome area, there's every reason to think that that has the potential to go to quite substantial depth and therefore represent a very substantial resource. In other areas, particularly the Otago district in New Zealand, steeply dipping discordant quartz veins like we see in the Klondike pass upwards and possibly downwards into very, very large, shallow dipping gold mineralized or gold-bearing shear zones. That's one of the things we're trying to evaluate in the Klondike right now, is could we be looking at a McRae's flat kind of a deposit at some depth underneath the present level of exposure? And if so, where would we look for that? McRae's flat deposit in New Zealand is linked to these discordant quartz veins in the Otago schist belt on South Island, and it represents a reserve of something on the order of 7 million plus ounces, and it's open in 3 directions, so a very large resource. Next, please. So the main conclusions of the study that I want to kind of leave you with, and this kind of will lead into what we'll be talking about this afternoon up at the Klondike Star Camp, and I'd certainly be more than happy to chat about any of these points or anything else I've discussed here with you individually in more detail afterwards. We've shown that the placer gold recovered from the Klondike placer deposits was recovered or was derived from within the Klondike. I think that's quite well established now. Certainly the coarser grained placer gold in the Klondike, and that you must keep in mind that when I say coarser gold, I'm talking about the kind of the gold that was coarse enough to have been recovered by the fairly primitive placer mining methods or recovery methods that have been used through much of the mining history of the Klondike. That was all derived from these mainly steeply dipping discordant quartz veins that I've been describing to you here, or possibly from larger vein systems that were genetically closely related to them. But we know what the source is. We know what style of mineralization we're actually looking for. One small caveat, there could be other sources of gold in the Klondike that contain very, very fine-grained gold that would not have been recovered by the placers and would have been flushed out of the system. Bottom line is that 750 to 1,500 tons of gold were recovered or were derived from these veins. There may have been other sources of gold here, but it was never sampled by the placers because the placer mining methods were not sufficient to recover that very, very fine-grained gold. The gold composition and the gold grain shape studies indicate that the main lode sources that fed these placers were confined or were localized to 4 relatively small areas within the Klondike. So we're not looking at gold that was derived from throughout the entire Klondike. We're looking at gold that was derived from relatively small areas within the Klondike, which again makes it a little bit easier to actually go out and explore. You don't have to drill the entire Klondike, you only have to drill bits of it. Available evidence, I would suggest, indicates that there's potential certainly for at least 1 or more major lode gold deposits still undiscovered or perhaps in the process of being discovered within the Klondike. But the bottom line is that it's not an easy puzzle to solve. If it had been easy, we would have solved it a long time ago. And trying to make sense of this and trying to identify the lode sources and trying to identify a viable, mineable resource within the Klondike is going to take a lot of very careful work, and that work really has to be done on a district scale. You can't go in and work on these things on a property scale. You've got to look at the whole system, or you really don't have that much of a chance of sorting out what's going on. Thanks very much.